He didn't come for Christmas. The quiet of the house in Naperville, Illinois settled differently this year. Not just the absence of my late husband, Robert, which was a constant hum beneath everything, but the specific, sharp silence where David's presence should have been. The chair at the dining table I had pulled out, the one right next to mine, remained tucked in, a silent accusation in the corner of my eye. It wasn't an oversight. The calls had stopped days before. The final one clipped and full of excuses that frayed around the edges like old fabric. He said something about weather, about work, things that didn't hold up to the clear sky outside, or the fact that his job didn't require him to be anywhere near an airport on Christmas Eve. It was just a decision, masked poorly, leaving behind a tangible void where anticipation had been. The tree lights blinked on the pile of gifts tucked beneath its branches, a colorful, stark reminder of preparations made in faith. Faith misplaced, it seemed. I had spent weeks picking things out, wrapping them with care, imagining his hands reaching for them, the brief moment of shared space and time. Now they just sat there, a monument to a promise broken. If any part of this story resonates with you, if you faced moments where the people you expected to be there simply weren't, please share where you are watching from below. I'm curious to know who else understands this quiet, particular kind of emptiness. The gifts were the worst part. More than the empty chair, more than the silent phone, they were tangible objects holding the weight of expectation and now, failure. There were three packages for David. A thick cashmere sweater I knew he wouldn't buy for himself, in a color I remembered him mentioning he liked years ago. A set of good quality tools, because he was always borrowing Robert's and never quite returning them. And a book, a first edition of an author he admired. Each one represented thought, memory, a desire to connect. Now they were just items, clutter beneath the festive lights. I walked past the tree multiple times that day, each pass a fresh prick. The wrapping paper felt too bright, the ribbons too cheerful for the mood in the room. I didn't turn on the Christmas music. Silence felt more honest. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, I could hear the distant laughter of neighbors, their own family Christmases unfolding as planned. Mine had unfolded differently. It had simply stopped. The day after Christmas was worse in its own way. The forced cheer of the 25th was over, replaced by the long, flat stretch of December 26th. The gifts were still there. They seemed to have multiplied in the night, taking up more space, demanding more attention. I drank my coffee black, sitting in the armchair by the window, watching a gray squirrel dig furiously in the frozen earth of the yard. The house felt large and empty. I thought about other Christmases. David, as a boy, tearing into presents with frantic energy, eyes bright. David, as a teenager, feigning coolness but still pleased with a carefully chosen gift. David, as a young man, home from college, bringing his laundry and a cheerful chaos into the quiet order Robert and I maintained. Those memories felt distant, filtered through a haze of something sad and irreversible. This year, there was only the stillness, the quiet condemnation of the untouched gifts. They were more than just presents. They were symbols of connection, of continuity, of family, and they were explicitly rejected. I got up and walked over to the tree. I knelt, the joints in my knees protesting slightly. I reached out and touched the corner of the largest gift, the one with the tools. The paper was cool and smooth. It felt heavy. I remembered going to the hardware store, talking to the salesman, trying to remember the specific kinds of pliers Robert always used. It had been an effort, a deliberate act of love. Now it felt like a foolish expenditure of energy and emotion. I looked at the other gifts. The sweater, folded neatly within its box. The book, its cover depicting an old sailing ship, something David had always been fascinated by. All chosen with care, all unwanted, implicitly, by his absence. It wasn't just that he didn't show up. It was that he didn't value the act of showing up, the culmination of weeks of preparation, the simple expectation of presence. It felt like a careful, deliberate dismissal of me, of the day, of the very idea of coming home. The idea came slowly, a cold, hard little knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't born of pique, not exactly. It was born of a deep, settled weariness, recognition of a pattern I hadn't allowed myself to fully see before. This wasn't the first time David had prioritized something else over family. It was just the most public, the most unavoidable instance. The missed birthdays, the canceled visits, the hurried phone calls where he sounded distracted, eager to hang up. Each one a tiny pebble dropped into a pool, the ripples spreading, changing the landscape of our relationship. These gifts, sitting here, were the accumulated weight of all those pebbles. I stood up, the gifts still at my feet. I looked around the living room. Everything was meticulously tidy, ordered, a life lived with care and attention to detail. A stark contrast to the careless dismissal those gifts represented. The silence in the house seemed to amplify the thought. It wasn't about the money spent. It wasn't entirely about the missed Christmas dinner. It was about the value placed or not placed on connection, on history, on me. The neighbors, the Millers, lived next door. They were younger, a family with two noisy, energetic boys. We weren't close friends, but friendly. We exchanged pleasantries, watched each other's houses, waved when we were getting the mail. Their Christmas had sounded exactly as it should, loud, full of laughter, punctuated by the happy shouts of children. I could almost hear the echoes through the wall. Even days later, their life felt full, connected. Mine felt pared back, reduced. I thought about the boys next door. They were roughly the age David had been when Christmases were still simple, joyous affairs. I imagined them unwrapping presents, their excitement, their parents' quiet pleasure and their happiness. It was a sharp contrast to the scene in my own living room. The untouched gifts, the silence, the heavy weight of disappointment that felt less like a single blow and more like a slow, insidious pressure. The impulse solidified into a decision. It wasn't impulsive, it felt like the natural, inevitable outcome of the emotional calculation I had been running, perhaps unconsciously, for years. These gifts were meant to convey love, connection, recognition. They had failed. They were symbols of a relationship that, at least from one side, seemed to exist more out of obligation than genuine desire. Leaving them there felt dishonest, a pretense I was no longer willing to maintain. Donating them wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about making David feel guilty, though perhaps a small, cold part of me acknowledged that might be a side effect. It was about shedding the symbols of a false reality. It was about clearing the space, both physical and emotional. It was about taking an action that reflected the reality of the situation, rather than the one I wished were true. I went back into the living room. The gifts were still there, waiting. I looked at them not as presents for my son, but as objects. A sweater, a set of tools, a book. Useful things. Desirable things, perhaps, to someone else. Someone who would appreciate them, use them, find value in them. I thought of the Miller boys. Maybe their father could use the tools. Maybe they knew someone who would enjoy the book or the sweater. It felt cleaner, less burdened. I wasn't angry anymore, not in a hot, explosive way. It was a cold, settled resolve, a quiet understanding that the emotional investment I had made in those gifts, and perhaps in the idea of David's continued reliable presence in my life, was no longer yielding returns. It was time to divest, to cut the losses, not in a financial sense, but in an emotional one. The gifts were the most obvious place to start. I gathered the three packages. I didn't unwrap them. They weren't mine to examine anymore. They belonged to a possibility that hadn't materialized. Carrying them felt strange, like carrying evidence of something failed. I walked them through the kitchen, past the uneaten Christmas cookies on the counter, past the refrigerator still full of holiday groceries. I put them in a large canvas bag by the back door. I would wait until later, maybe this afternoon, when the chill wasn't so sharp, when the Millers were likely to be home but not occupied with something important. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a practical one, an act of disposal, almost. Getting rid of things that no longer served their purpose. The purpose of connecting me to my son in a way that felt warm and reliable. That purpose was clearly not being met. The waiting was harder than the decision. The canvas bag sat by the door, a quiet presence in the back hallway. Every time I passed it, I felt a small, sharp pang. Not regret, but a recognition of the finality it represented. This wasn't just about Christmas gifts. It was about acknowledging a shift, a fundamental change in the landscape of my life. My son, my only child, was building a life elsewhere, a life that seemed to have less and less room for me, for these traditions, for the simple act of coming home. I had poured so much into him, into his upbringing, his education, his happiness, not with the expectation of repayment, but with the quiet, fundamental belief that he would remain connected, that the bond would deepen, not fray. The gifts in the bag were physical proof of that fraying, proof I could no longer ignore. I saw Mrs. Miller bundling up one of her boys around 3 o'clock. They were heading out maybe to the park despite the cold. I decided this was the moment. It was quick, minimal interaction. I put on my coat and boots, picked up the canvas bag, and walked out the back door, across the narrow strip of frozen lawn that separated our houses. Mrs. Miller saw me coming and paused on her porch. She smiled, a little wary perhaps. I wasn't usually one for impromptu visits. Her son, bundled in a bright blue snowsuit, peered around her leg. "Eleanor?" "Hi," she said, her breath misting in the air. "Everything all right?" Her tone was kind, neighborly. It made the simple act feel harder and, paradoxically, easier. I held up the bag. "Hello, Sarah," I said. My voice sounded steady, perhaps a little flat. "These are some Christmas gifts. For David. He couldn't make it this year." The simple sentence hung in the air between us. It felt inadequate, a vast understatement. "They're lovely things, but they won't get used here. I wondered if you might know someone who could use them. Perhaps for your own family, or if you know a family in need." Sarah's expression shifted. Her smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. She didn't pry, didn't ask follow-up questions about David's absence. She simply looked at the bag, then at me, and nodded. "Oh, Eleanor," she said softly. "I'm so sorry he couldn't make it." It was a simple acknowledgement, but it landed heavily. Someone saw it. Someone recognized the quiet disappointment embedded in my words. "Yes," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "Well, these are here. If they could be of use." I extended the bag slightly. Sarah reached out and took it. Her hand brushed mine briefly. Her fingers were cold. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said. "That's very generous. I'm sure we can find a good home for them. My husband, maybe those." She trailed off, looking down at the bag. It wasn't about the tools, or the sweater, or the book. It was about the gesture, the redirection of energy and expectation. I nodded again. "Merry Christmas, Sarah. Happy New Year." It felt strange saying it. Days after Christmas. "You too, Eleanor," she replied. Her son, the little one, waved uncertainly from behind her. I gave a small wave back. I turned and walked back across the yard. The air felt lighter, sharp. The house felt different when I stepped back inside. Emptier, yes, but also cleaner. The space under the tree was bare now, just the tree stand and a few stray needles. The absence felt less like a void and more like a canvas. Something removed to make space for something else. What that something else was, I didn't know yet, but the act of giving away the gifts felt significant. It wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It was a quiet declaration that I was no longer holding on to a version of reality that wasn't true. David hadn't come. The gifts were unnecessary. Their purpose was void. Redirecting them felt like a small, quiet reclaiming of my own agency. I hadn't thrown them away. I had given them life elsewhere, usefulness in a place where they were wanted. It felt like a small victory, private and unsung. Later that week, an email arrived from David. It was brief, an apology, vaguely worded, for missing Christmas. More excuses, no mention of the gifts. He didn't ask if I'd had a nice day. He didn't ask how I was. It was purely transactional. A digital box checked. Reading it felt like receiving confirmation. Confirmation that the emotional distance was real, perhaps even intentional. He didn't know about the gifts. He didn't know they were gone. And perhaps he wouldn't have cared if he did. That thought was the coldest one yet. It settled deep in my bones, a chill that the warmest sweater couldn't dispel. This wasn't just about a missed holiday. It was about a fundamental difference in how we viewed our connection, our obligations to each other. For him, it seemed, it was a lesser priority, easily set aside. For me, it had been a cornerstone. That's when the real shift began. It wasn't a sudden dramatic change, but a slow, steady reevaluation of my life, my time, my resources. The empty space under the tree wasn't just bare. It was a question mark. What now? What happens when the central expectation of your life, the continuity of family, the closeness with your child, shifts, shrinks, perhaps even disappears? I started looking at my house differently. The things I had accumulated, the plans I had made assuming a certain future. I was retired. Robert was gone. David was. Elsewhere, my life, as it was, felt less like a continuation and more like a pivot point. The quiet anger I had felt, the cold resolve, began to morph into something else, a determination to build something new, something that was entirely mine, not dependent on the choices or presence of others. The gifts were gone. What else needed to go? I started with the small things. The collection of mugs David had used in college, still in a box in the basement. The stack of his old textbooks. Things I had held onto for no real reason except that they were his. I took them to a local donation center. It felt less significant than the Christmas gifts, but it was part of the same process. A quiet clearing out, making space. Not just physical space, but mental and emotional space. Space that had been occupied by expectation, by hope, by a kind of passive waiting. I was done waiting. I was done hoping for a return to something that likely wouldn't come. I needed to occupy the space myself, to fill it with my own presence, my own choices. I started keeping a journal. Not a diary of my feelings, but a factual log. Dates of calls or emails from David. How long they lasted. What was discussed. Visits promised, visits canceled. Specific things he said or didn't say. It felt almost clinical, like collecting data. It wasn't for anyone else's eyes, not at first. It was for me. To see the pattern laid out plainly, undeniable. To stop minimizing, to stop making excuses for him in my own mind. The entries were short, sparse. DSEC 24, call from David. 5 minutes. Excuses re weather work, not visiting. Jan 5, email from David, brief. No mention of holiday. Jan 18, text asking about old family photo. No, how are you? Reading the entries back, the pattern was stark. A slow, steady withdrawal. A focus on his needs, his convenience, with little apparent consideration for mine. The documentation process, dry as it was empowering in a quiet way. It stripped away the emotional fog. It replaced disappointment with clarity. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't imagining things. This was the reality. This was the relationship as it existed, not as I wished it to be. It made the decision to give away the gifts, feel not cruel, but simply honest, a reflection of the actual connection, or lack thereof. I continued to live my life in Naperville. I went to the grocery store, saw neighbors, maintained my routine. But internally, a shift was occurring. I was drawing a line, not in anger, but in self-preservation. My emotional energy was finite. I couldn't keep pouring it into a well that seemed to be slowly, deliberately being filled in from the other side. One afternoon, I sat down with my financial advisor, a sensible woman named Susan who had helped me manage things since Robert passed. We usually talked about investments, market fluctuations. This time, I brought up my will. It felt morbid, but necessary. We discussed beneficiaries. David was the primary one, of course. That had been the plan for decades. But I started asking questions. What were my options? Could I set conditions? Could I change things? Susan was professional, neutral. She explained the possibilities, the legal implications. We didn't talk about why I was asking, not directly. But I think she sensed it. There was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. She had seen plenty of families, plenty of complicated relationships. I left her office with a folder full of information and a clearer understanding of the practical steps I could take. It wasn't about punishing David with money. It was about ensuring my own security and potentially redirecting resources towards things or people who were actually present in my life, who showed care and connection. The power wasn't in cutting him off entirely, but in understanding that I had options, that I wasn't bound by outdated expectations. The journal continued. The entries remained sparse but steady, each one a small, quiet act of witnessing the reality of the distance, witnessing the gradual erosion of what I had believed was a solid foundation. I didn't confront David with it. There seemed no point. The documentation wasn't for him. It was for me, to solidify my own understanding, to prepare for the possibility that this distance was permanent. It gave me a quiet strength, an inner core of certainty that wasn't reliant on his validation or his presence. The house still felt quiet, but it no longer felt empty in the same way. It felt like my space, a space I was actively choosing to inhabit and define. I started spending more time on my own interests. The book club I had joined years ago, I became more involved. I started taking a painting class at the Lull Community Center, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. These activities weren't distractions, they felt like deliberate acts of building a life that was centered on my own interests, my own connections, independent of the traditional family structure that felt increasingly fragile. I met new people. Interesting women, mostly, navigating their own later years, their own family complexities. We didn't share sob stories, but there was an unspoken understanding, a shared resilience. These connections felt different. They felt chosen, mutual, not bound by history or obligation. They were based on shared interests and present company. One evening, I was talking to one of the women from my painting class, a kind retired librarian named Martha. We were having coffee after class. Casually, she mentioned her son, who lived nearby and had dinner with her every Sunday. It was a simple statement, but it landed with the weight of contrast. I didn't dwell on it, didn't launch into my own situation. But later, driving home through the familiar streets of Naperville, I thought about it. The easy, regular connection, the simple expectation of presence. It highlighted the stark reality of my own situation, but without bitterness. It simply reinforced the fact that my experience wasn't universal, and that the connection I craved wasn't inherently impossible. It just wasn't happening with David. I started to think about what kind of future I wanted. Not the future I had assumed I would have, filled with grandchildren and holiday gatherings and easy familiarity, but a future built on the reality of my life now. It meant making deliberate choices about my time, my energy, my relationships, the journal, the meeting with Susan, the painting class. These were all part of that process. They were steps towards building a framework for a life that was self-sufficient, emotionally robust, and independent. The empty space under the tree became less of a reminder of absence and more of a symbol of freedom. Freedom from expectation, from disappointment, from the passive waiting that had characterized too many of my recent years. The quiet power of saying no, of withdrawing my emotional investment from a place where it wasn't valued, was transformative. It wasn't about being cold or cutting off David entirely. It was about recognizing my own worth and protecting my own emotional well-being. The gifts given to the Millers were the first step, a physical manifestation of that internal shift. It felt like a small act of defiance, yes, but mostly like an act of self-preservation. I was redirecting not just physical objects, but the energy and care they represented towards a place where they might be received and appreciated. It was a quiet, internal redistribution of wealth, emotional wealth. David eventually found out about the gifts, not from me. Sarah Miller, seeing him perhaps visiting briefly weeks later, a rare occurrence, must have mentioned it perhaps innocuously. He called me, his voice sharp, accusatory. "Why would you do that?" he demanded. "Give my things away? To the neighbors?" There was a sense of outrage, of violation in his tone. He didn't sound hurt that he had missed Christmas, or apologetic for his absence. He sounded angry that something he felt was rightfully his had been given to someone else. It was a revealing reaction. It confirmed everything the journal entries implied. His focus was on possession, on his perceived rights, not on the relationship or the feelings involved. My response was quiet, calm. "They were Christmas gifts, David," I said. My voice didn't waver. "They were meant for you when you came for Christmas. You didn't come. They were taking up space here. They were useful things. The Millers could use them." There was a pause on his end. He seemed thrown by my lack of defensiveness, my simple statement of fact. "But they were mine," he repeated, the entitlement clear. "They weren't yours, David," I replied, perhaps too sharply, but the words felt necessary. "They were gifts. Their purpose was tied to your presence. When you weren't here, their purpose here ceased to exist." The line felt clean, definitive. It wasn't a rebuke, it was a statement of logic, consequences. He sputtered for a moment, then shifted tack. He accused me of being passive-aggressive, of trying to make him feel guilty. He listed his reasons for not coming again. The same flimsy excuses. I listened, but I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. The reality was plain. He hadn't come. I had acted. His reaction wasn't about my action. It was about his discomfort with the consequence of his own inaction. "I'm not trying to make you feel anything, David. I said finally. I'm simply living my life. Those gifts were part of a plan that didn't happen. I made a new plan for them. The conversation ended shortly after, unresolved in his mind, perhaps, but feeling very resolved in mine. It was the last time we spoke for a while. The silence that followed felt different this time. Not heavy with disappointment, but light with a strange sense of freedom. The weeks turned into months. The space under the tree remained empty. The journal lay on my desk, its entries a quiet record of a relationship redefined. I continued with my classes, my book club, my new routines. My life in Naperville felt solid, centered on my own choices and connections. I redecorated the living room slightly, moving furniture, adding new artwork. The space felt more truly mine than it had in years. It wasn't filled with the ghosts of Christmases past or the expectation of future visits that might not come. It was filled with my own presence, my own taste, my own life. I hadn't cut David out of my life entirely. I would still answer if he called, reply to an email. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer waiting, no longer hoping with bated breath, no longer organizing my life around his potential presence. I was living my life fully, actively, in the present. The emotional center had moved. It was no longer external, located in the unpredictable actions of my son. It was internal, located within me. The quiet act of giving away those gifts had been a catalyst. It had forced an acknowledgement of reality and spurred a reclaiming of self. One sunny afternoon, months after Christmas, Sarah Miller stopped me as I was getting the mail. She had her younger son with her. Eleanor, she said, smiling warmly, just wanted to let you know, Mark, that's his father. He absolutely loves that set of tools. He's been using them all the time. And the book. My older son read it and really enjoyed it. Thank you again, truly. Her younger son, the one who had been bundled against the cold that December afternoon, looked up at me and smiled. He was holding a brightly colored toy truck. I smiled back at Sarah, a genuine, easy smile this time. I'm so glad, I said. I hoped they would be useful. It was a small interaction, but it felt significant. The objects that represented disappointment and absence in my life had found a place of usefulness and appreciation elsewhere. Their story had continued, just not with the person they were originally intended for. And that felt right. It felt like a quiet, gentle closing of a chapter and the beginning of a new one, written by my own hand. My house was quiet, yes, but it was no longer empty. It was full of my life.